everyone. I'm Elise. Today I will be talking about the paradoxical representations of the feminine within Tantric Buddhism. So, Alan Sponberg identifies 4 attitudes towards women and the feminine that appear in early Buddhism. These are, as is well known, institutional androcentrism, ascetic misogyny, soteriological inclusiveness, and soteriological androgyny. The first 2 attitudes subordinate women to men. The second 2 attitudes undermine the foundations for that subordination. In institutional and literary terms, monastics have historically treated women and the feminine with anxiety and suspicion. Yet those same monastics participate in the transmission of a doctrine that undermines male chauvinism and explicitly indicates a non-restricted role for women on the path to, and ultimately the outcome of, awakening. Within the soteriological dimension of Buddhism, the goal of Buddhahood is defined or is imagined in terms of gender complementarity. There is an apparent disconnect between the chauvinism and the soteriology. This dichotomy is evident but not inevitable in text and iconography. Today, I will discuss several ways that Buddhist doctrine and iconography undermines its own institutional, doctrinal, and ascetic subordination of women and the feminine, specifically with examples that show exaltation of the feminine. In particular, my analysis focuses on tantric images to show that Sponberg's attitudes are also present in tantric ideology and iconography, not just in early Buddhism. And even though these 4 attitudes do appear, they are also unsettled by classical tantric representations and teachings. So the first of Sponberg's attitudes is institutional androcentrism, which restricts a woman's religious career and reinforces systems of male authority. In the Vinaya scriptures, for example, women must take many more vows to become a nun than men do to become a monk. Once initiated, nuns are given fewer leadership opportunities. This lack of leadership positions meant less public prestige than was afforded male counterparts. The reasoning behind this attitude might be largely founded in historical realities. Monasteries in India had to rely on a conservative local Brahmanical culture for financial support. Since nuns were women who didn't fit into any of the traditional social roles assigned to them, daughter, wife, mother, or son's charge, they might have been objects of suspicion. Would-be patrons might be loath to support an institution where women played no traditional social role. In this purely economic sense, it was in the interests of Buddhist institutions to operate within these cultural structures that subordinated women in order to secure wider cultural support. A clear example of not biting the hand that feeds you. Ascetic misogyny is seen in the suspicion and anxiety around women, particularly their bodies, that animates some Buddhist scriptures. In this view, women exist as objects of distraction and desire. Femininity itself is a destructive and corrupting force in a way that masculinity is not. Yet, while femininity is strong enough to corrupt the will of a male saint, it is also too weak to achieve liberation. Masculinity is idealized in the Vinaya, but it is also vulnerable, easily tainted, easily corrupted by lusty women. This framing of women as inherently lecherous appears in a lot of Buddhist scripture. Soteriological inclusiveness seems to undermine the foundations of androcentrism and misogyny. According to Buddhist teachings on Buddha nature, all beings possess the ability to attain enlightenment, regardless of sex or gender. But despite the soteriological insignificance of being a woman, some Buddhist thinkers and texts assert, or perhaps recognize, that being born a woman constitutes a worse situation in samsara than being born a man. Since women face androcentrism and misogyny in this life, it is easy to internalize ideas of women's natural weakness and inferiority. This in turn leads to lamenting one's own female state, like we see in the Lotus Sutra, where a woman affirms the necessity of first being a man in order to then achieve enlightenment. Women, therefore, are able to reach enlightenment, but not as women. In this sense, soteriological inclusiveness seems to only include women conditionally, or perhaps historical male chauvinists unable to deny the inclusivity existing in the doctrine have willfully diluted notions of the ultimate with the conventional realities of gender politics. In other words, blinded by their own misogyny, they have taken the conventional truth of women's cultural inferiority and assumed that women's soteriological inferiority is a truth too. This seems likely, considering that Pali scriptures clearly indicate many women attained enlightenment and were publicly recognized as saints during the Buddha's lifetime. Soteriological androgyny is an implicit element of definitive Buddhist ideology. Femininity and masculinity exist as complementary and mutually reinforcing, two parts that combine into a whole. To reach enlightenment, a Buddhist needs a perfect balance of wisdom, prajna, which is feminine, and skillful means, upaya, which is masculine. The existence of femininity, therefore, is not only undeniable in a religious context, but inevitable. It is literally the wisdom of the path. Soteriological androgyny is based in the fundamental Buddhist concept of the middle way. It often appears in Tantric training, where masculine and feminine work in tandem. Modern Buddhist teachers often emphasize the importance of developing a balance of healthy qualities linked with notions of the feminine and healthy qualities linked with notions of the masculine. Some scholars, however, have labeled even this idea as chauvinistic because in the wisdom, skillful means model, the feminine element of wisdom is considered passive, while the masculine element of skillful means is considered active. If I can dwell on this point for a moment, I want to push back on that criticism. It's not immediately obvious that being passive is inferior to being active, especially in Buddhism, where dissatisfaction and suffering are characterized by activity, whereas nirvana is peace, and awakening is described as being unwavering. Dismissing wisdom as inferior simply because it is not dynamic seems an unnecessary projection of Western assumptions. In a Buddhist concept or context, being unwavering or even passive in the face of samsara means not faltering in one's own fundamental nature of simplicity and peace. It makes wisdom quietly the crucial element, that which makes Buddhism what it truly is. Now that I've reviewed Sponberg's attitudes, I want to give some examples that complicate them. Firstly, according to the fundamental Buddhist doctrine of no self, conventional truths like sex characteristics and gender expression are not real. They have no solid reality outside of the cultural consensus that identifies them. The teaching of no self, along with emptiness, is a definitive teaching. It's a statement that explicitly declares the nature of reality, so it has no need for interpretation. Sex and gender have no ultimate essence. On the other hand, a statement that is based on cultural conventions, like claiming that women are spiritually inferior to men, begs for analysis. These cultural conventions are, in the end, statements that carry social weight, but nothing more. Since many groups are steeped in chauvinist assumptions, their cultural conventions reflect that, which then, again, create more chauvinist assumptions, creating a cyclical pattern. So no surprise to find misogyny across human cultures, whether Buddhist or not, and whether their own doctrines blatantly discount it or not. Indeed, the presence of definitive doctrines like no self and emptiness have certainly not removed chauvinism from Buddhist cultures. With this in mind, I want to offer a few more examples that resist misogynistic interpretations. Take, for example, the Buddha Tara. In one of her origin stories, she was a princess, Wisdom Moon, who wished to take the Bodhisattva path. When Wisdom Moon expressed her wish to the monks of her community, she was told, like in the Lotus Sutra example, to pray to be reborn a man. But Wisdom Moon denounces this suggestion and gives voice to ultimate truth. She says there is no man, there is no woman. Labeling male and female has no essence but deceives the evil-minded world. After which Wisdom Moon gained liberation in her female form and became known as Tara, she who liberates. Tara's declaration emphasizes the absurdity of thinking male and female are real. She denies all aspects of male superiority, especially in her vow to only be reborn as a woman. The fact that this story has been transmitted continually in a chauvinist culture indicates, I think, the fact that chauvinism is considered, in some sense, a tenuous position. Another complication to male chauvinism is the reality that historical women have established genuine Buddhist lineages. Machi Globdron, for example, founded one of the most popular forms of practice in Tibetan history. Pali literature also provides many examples of women, both during and after the Buddha's lifetime, who excelled religiously. The wise nun Kema, for example, teaches using similes, just as the Buddha himself did, which is a strategy that's not attributed to any of the Buddhist's other disciples. There is also a story of Kema blatantly rejecting Mara's temptations of sexual indulgence, which rather neatly rebuts misogynistic interpretations of inherent female lechery. Damadina, Kajangala, and Sona are just a few examples of other women who were exceptional teachers of the Dharma. These women stand out against the male chauvinism of androcentric institutionalism and ascetic misogyny, showing that women have what it takes to succeed as religious leaders. The figure of the Dakinis also offers an interesting challenge to chauvinism. Dakinis are awakened female entities that have unique powers. They can cross between realms and even enter the dreams and visions of adepts. These skills give them a vital role because they can actually bestow powers that lead to enlightenment. That male practitioners in particular require the intervention and help of Dakinis is notable, especially in a religious tradition that is oftentimes rather individualistic. Without the Dakinis, or by extension, feminine wisdom, prajna, enlightenment is impossible. They offer, at the very least, a symbolic pushback of misogyny. Most of these examples have been from textual sources, but there are also symbolic dimensions of tantric practice that are worth mentioning. One of these is male devotion to female Buddhas. Devotees of female Buddhas were and are just as likely to be men as to be women. But regardless of the sex of the meditator, the feminine is the idealized representation of the ultimate superhuman state. There is also, just to take another single example, the 8th century woman Yeshe Tsogyal, partner to Padmasambhava. She is considered an emanation of 3 Buddhas, Tara, Vajrayogini, and Samantambhadri. When we look at this image of her, we note that Padmasambhava is represented symbolically by the Katvanga staff. He is the secondary element of the image, appearing as a junior partner. This is worth mentioning because feminist scholars of Tibetan Buddhism have pointed out subordinating strategies, often used when depicting female figures, such as their size, the fact that they're facing away from the audience, and so on. Sarah Jacobi, in particular, is relevant in this regard. I've benefited immensely from relying on her. Here, I want to emphasize that Yeshe Tsogyal is the fundamental, she's the primary Buddha, she's large, facing outwards. On the other hand, Padmasambhava is small and hidden in a symbol. This is a soteriologically gynocentric image. It stands in stark contrast to the idea that normative iconography is always androcentric or even androgynous. Even in chauvinist articulations, the feminine element of gender complementarity is inevitably symbolically evident. So today, I have attempted to concisely explore several ways that Buddhist doctrine and iconography undermines the chauvinist practices of its own monastics. Even through a long history of institutional, doctrinal, and ascetic subordination of women and the feminine, these empowering narratives have been perpetuated and maintained within the canon. This fact may reflect what scholars such as Richard Gombrich have described in terms of the principle of textual criticism, lectio difficilior potior. It refers to the concept that the most difficult or out-of-place passages are likely the original ones. If this is the case, images like Yeshe Tsogyal and stories such as Tara and the women in the Pali scriptures attaining enlightenment represent what is, for the true follower of the Buddhist teachings, an inevitable and unavoidable truth. Women are soteriologically equal to men. Why else would these teachings that undermine chauvinism still be transmitted by chauvinist cultures? Thank you.